Bonjour toutes et tous et bienvenue à la 10e édition du Festival de l'Histoire de l'Art. Et je voudrais aujourd'hui présenter Madame Ayelet Zohar, voilà, maître de conférences et chercheuse en Histoire de l'Art à l'Université de Tel-Aviv. Voilà. Et sa recherche se focalise sur la photographie japonaise. Et en décembre 2020, Madame Zohar a complété l'édition spéciale du Contemporary Photography in Japan pour la revue qui s'appelle Review of Japanese Culture and Society. Et for the contemporary photography in Japan. Et donc, Madame Zohar va bientôt publier, donc en 2022, elle va publier un livre qui s'appelle Performating Recollection, War Memory in Contemporary Japanese. It's okay? Ok. Voilà. Donc, voilà, donc je voudrais donc vous inviter à écouter Madame Zohar. Yoroshiku onegai shimasu.
I have to apologize that my French is so poor that I cannot afford to give a talk in French, so please forgive me for using English. But I'm really delighted to be here. It's a huge pleasure, and the festival is so interesting, and I learned a lot, and I've been attending several conferences and panels that were exciting with a lot of information. So I hope to contribute my little knowledge for the sake of the audience to share with me. So talking about women photographers in Japan is quite an interesting subject because Japanese photography was always very much a masculine world. Actually, the word for Japanese photographers was cameraman. And Tokiwa, one of the early women photographers, called herself cameraman in skirt because she was referring to the fact that it was exclusively masculine and there were no women photographers participating in the field. So what I'm going to look into is this kind of crash or revolution that took place in the late 1980s, that from an exclusive male world, it became dominant by women photographers. If you're looking at what is being shown in Japanese museums, galleries today, you will see that women photographers are probably the majority. So it's a very interesting shift that took place over the Heisei era, which started in 1989 and completed in 2019. And I will try to look into the reasons what happened. So one of the first things that happened as the Heisei started, 7th of January 1989, the Emperor Hirohito died, and the next day his son Akihito took the throne, and that started a new era. But several months after that, Japan experienced a dramatic financial crisis with the collapse of what they call the bubble economy of the 1980s, where the Japanese economy was rocketing in all financial markets and land ownership rocketed in prices, etc. And as we know, these things don't go to the moon, they collapse at some point. And in Japan, it happened in mid-1989. From that point on, Japan went into a financial and economic crisis that one could say did not end yet, 3 decades on. So that was something that marked the entry into the Heisei after the long decades of huge financial success of Japan. All of a sudden, Japan lost its financial point, and as a result, it brought also a very large change into society. That means that lifetime employment that was very common in the decades before lost its grounds. A lot of family went bankrupt, and people had to seek new ways of surviving through this financial crisis, which didn't end very soon. A new generation that was born into struggling families and situation that was not as flourishing and grand as it was in the past. So that is one thing we have to understand about Japanese society, and probably a very general view of what happened to Japanese women in society. That means that if the more conservative view of men going to work, women stay at home and bring up the children, families that experienced this kind of crisis and had to seek more modes and means of income, had to send women, young women, wives, mothers to work to earn the bread and butter for the daily life. So women all of a sudden started to be more involved in social life more than before. It's not sorted out. Don't think that Japan achieved equality through these years. It's still a very big struggle in Japan, but it is, the crisis had an opening, an opportunity to women to become more participant in the general life. And in the field of photography, I would like to identify two threads of what happened and how women started to be participant in the field. So my analysis of this trend is divided into two types, into two modes of participation of women photographers. The first one I call the selfie, which is a word very common today. We talk about the selfie. The phones has this function that you can turn the lens towards yourself. But when we're talking about selfies in the 1980s and beginning of the 1990s, it's slightly different, and I will develop more about that. And then the performative, which I'm relating to a mode of photography which is not direct, which is not about documenting, which is not about looking at one's own life or environment, but it's actually creating a performative act, which means theatrical, based on some imagery, narratives, stories, fairy tales, situations in life, borrowing clothing, doing some sort of performance or theater or stage up or reenactment, many forms of this performative. But what is quite clear about the performative, that it's not a direct photography. So the difference between the selfie and the performative is the difference between direct photography and mediated photography, or something which is staged up to perform some sort of idea. So what is the selfie? And specifically, I relate here to three photographers. I will show the photographs of two of them, which are Hiromix, Nagashima Yudhiye, and Ninagawa Mika. All three of them started their career with very direct photographs, either of themselves or the people around them, the people who were close to them. And they gained much attention. A lot of people looked at them. And I will try to look with you together today at the images of these three photographers. And it's not that I just picked up these three names. The best or the most evaluated photography prize in Japan, the Kimura Ihei Prize, was given to the three of them together in 2000. So even the Japanese institutions recognized the place of these three photographers as very dominant and important, and probably three photographers who marked the change that took place in the 1990s. What is important that when we're thinking about how they made their debut, their start point in the photography world, we can see that they were introduced by two very important figures in the art world, which are Araki Nobuyoshi and Iizawa Kotaro, who is a photography critic. I will talk about these two guys in a moment later, but also wanted to mention that the photography of these three women and others as well, not just the three of them, and we will talk about them in a moment, was in many ways a contradiction, something that went against the tradition that was identified with Japanese photography before that. I will go just for a moment to the 1970s. 1969, 68, 69, there was a Japanese journal called Provoke, and the dominant person in that journal was Moriyama Daido, a photographer who was associated with William Klein, an American photographer. And both of them worked in black and white, very sharp, very contrasty style of photography. And one of the critics, actually he's French, Philippe Cherrière, he wrote about Moriyama that he was a hunter. He used to catch photographs, very snappy, very quick. And also he worked with very contrast style of film and development. And the quality of the images associated with Provoke was called in Japanese arebure bokeh, which means grainy, out of focus and blurry, which means these photographs had a very special, very tactile, material quality to them, which 1974, a few years later, in the early 1970s, John Sherkovsky, who was the curator of photography at MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, he made a big exhibition of modern Japanese photography. He invited all these guys who were associated with Provoke and made this exhibition, which marked for the Western world what Japanese photography was like. So in the West, the association of Japanese photography was arebure bokeh, this blurry, grainy, and out of focus, which is associated with the style of the Provoke magazine. When Hiromix and Nagashima and Ninagawa started to work, they were working in a very different style. And so the way they were associated with the past was kind of a break. They turned something quite different. Also, I want to mention that Moriyama and Araki, which is not exactly associated with Provoke, but Nakahara and other photographers, part of their subject matter was going to American bases in Japan, bar areas near these bases, the women of the after hours. There was a lot of kind of peeping Tom association with the photography of Provoke. It was a very male photography. Its attitude, its kind of imagery was very much associated with male gaze and sort of voyeuristic scopophilia approach to photography. And while the ladies that I associate with the selfie, they turn the camera back to themselves, probably went something a little bit different than was associated. So Hiromix, Nagashima, and Ninagawa, they went into something that was not about peeping and a voyeuristic point of view, but actually doing something which is self-exposure, something which is direct. And it was something which was not made by men. As I said, men were the dominant power, but something that was transferring the power to the woman who is making the photographs and doing it as a selfie. And still, one of my criticism of this is that the way they constructed the images and how they designed themselves to the camera was very much influenced by the male gaze. So it seems to me that even if Hiromix, Ninagawa, and Nagashima tried to create photographs that expressed their own view and their selfie and their kind of control of the camera, the final images produced were actually playing with the kind of images that we normally associate with Araki or with Moriyama and these kind of guys. So as I said, Araki was the person who actually stood behind a Cosmos Prize that Hiromix received in '95, and later they pushed with Izawa. They pushed the three ladies into the Kimura Ihei Prize, and so what is also very troubling for me is that Izawa created the term girly photography, onanoko shashinka. So the word girly or onanoko, which is, it's a kind of a pejorative term. It's not really giving them the color because they're girlies, right? They're the little girls that run around to entertain the male viewers probably, or there's something very troubling about this term. And I just can tell you that before I started this special issue of Review of Japanese Culture and Society, which I wanted to dedicate to Heisei photography, I met Izawa-san and I spoke to him, and he still was using this term girl photography. And I just told him, you know what, I want to have a woman critic writing about women photographers rather than you calling them girly photographers, because this is still hanging on to an attitude that doesn't give them a real place, but looks at them as sort of entertainers. So it's not something that started in 1990 and disappeared. It carries on, and it's still something which is around. So just to give you an idea, these are the pictures of Hiromix. And as you can see, she's directing the camera to herself, always with some sort of sexualized image or semi-naked, or positioning herself in a kind of tempting or she's looking at herself in a kind of a male view of her body, and the way she displays her body always carries some sort of idea of how women had been displayed in art history and how she is going to play herself. Now, the second person I want to relate to is Nagashima Yudhiye, and as you will see, she created the first series in 1993. She was very young. She was not even 20 at the time, which she directed to her family. She took pictures of her brother, her mother, her father, everyone naked, everyone together at home, very intimate, very simple, but naked. Now, on one hand, it was very sincere and very open-ended, and really a lot of people admire these pictures for their sincerity, intimacy, directness, and openness. However, over the years, Nagashima experienced very tragic experience because a lot of people related to these pictures as semi-pornographic. And people used them in indecent ways and exposed them and displayed them as critical, in a very conservative way, that she was displaying her family naked, and they were very critical of her, to the point that Nagashima, at a certain point, decided that she doesn't want to have this picture displayed anymore. When I wrote about her in the journal, wrote the article, I asked her permission to use the images, and she said, no, you're not going to use the images in an article. And this is an academic article trying to interpret and bring, the positive aspect of this, but she refused. It felt to me that she was very traumatic about her experience of people looking at these pictures. Now she has a son who's 20 years old, and he was also a voice that said, no, Mama, you're not going to put these naked pictures of yours because they're being exploited. And so I had to publish it with the article with square white empty areas with captions only, because Nagashima will not give me permission to use the images. As long as I wrote about it, it's fine, but she doesn't want them to be seen anymore, not in this context. And you can see that the pictures she created for herself are very provocative and very putting herself in a position of criticism, but still using her body in a very sexualized way. And I think 20 years later, she feels that she created a very problematic position for herself, and she has second thoughts. It's not me. I was wanting to write about it in as a provocative and very critical, but the result was that Nagashima herself is withdrawing from this idea. So the girly photography of Hiromix and Nagashima is associated with the identity, with the persona of Araki Nobuyoshi. You probably know him from this kind of images that are very exploitive. And you have to remember that Araki was recently, 2018, sued by his former model, Kaori. She sued him, she took him to court in New York, accusing him for exploiting her as a model, financially, socially, whatever, you know. She sued him for a lot of money, something like $1 million, for using her for so long, for this kind of photographs, and never really paying her properly, never really respecting her name and her contribution. So, you know, after Me Too, everything changed very dramatically, and a lot of women started to talk back and demand their place in this kind of relationship. So even if the selfie was a position that women directed the camera, they still did it with sort of working with, collaborating with the male gaze, which 20 years later, they found to be very problematic and probably rethinking the idea. So the second part I would like to refer to is the performative, which I mentioned earlier. What does it mean? So this idea of the performative is actually looking in a different direction, which is against the direct photography we just saw. Hiromix and Nagashima directed the camera to themselves, and they wanted to bring something real, something honest, something naive even. And in this respect, they continued from the style of the 1970s. But as you know, the 1980s brought a new trend and a new idea and a new practice into the art world, which we called postmodern, or something that was looking back into the ideas and the values of modernism and trying to rethink about them in different ways. So the idea of postmodernism was to rethink the images that we know already, to reevaluate, redo, and restage, reenact all these ideas that we had in the past. And I would even add to that, 1990, Judith Butler, a very famous gender studies scholar in Berkeley, California, published a book which was called Gender Trouble. And in that book, she argued that gender is something that we perform. We have models, we have ideas that we follow, and this is how we perform gender. And from that publication, the whole idea of how the body is performing, what is to be a male, what is to be a female, what is to be a woman, what is to be a man, what is to be masculine, what is to be feminine, started to become something much more questionable, something that we look into and don't take for granted, and we think about the different modes of this idea. I'm not sure how it works in France, but I can tell you that in the American academic world, this became a very central idea of exploring what is our identity in relation to the question of gender. So in Japan, when we're going back to the question of photography, 1988, which is, you know, just on the verge of Heisei, the last year of Showa period, Morimura Yasumasa, who is an artist from Osaka and a very interesting figure, he created an image that probably changed the world of Japanese photography for good. He dressed up like Manet's Olympia, exposing his masculine body and actually performing the two subjects, you know, the Olympia herself and the servant behind, the black woman and the supposedly white woman. And as you know, Olympia of Manet was such a provocative image. He created it in 1863. It was first time shown in 1865. and created huge cry in Paris for being so provocative as a naked woman is lying on the bed and looking back at the audience. And I think for Morimura, the provocative element of Olympia and the fact that it was such a controversial image was very important for him. He wanted this controversy and this provocation and this question mark that lies with Olympia to serve his point. As a Japanese man, he, of course, was under the Western view of the effeminized body of the Asian man. And he wanted to kind of challenge the idea of what is a man and what is a woman and what is provocative and what is legitimate and what is not. And by posing himself as the two, and also you can say that race is coming into the discussion here because he's also the Black woman and the supposedly white woman who is a Japanese man dressed as a woman, not hiding himself to be a man. He's not pretending to be a woman here. And so he's just challenging every aspect with this the ambiguity of the body, of presentation, and doing that through the performance, through the performative aspect. But this was not the only image he created. He created Marcel Duchamp's Rose c'est la vie. As you probably know, Duchamp used this alter ego of Rose c'est la vie as a feminine image of himself, very important and idea in the development of Marcel Duchamp, who became probably the most significant conceptual artist in art history. And Morimura is following Duchamp, but he's emphasizing the doubleness here. Two hats, two pairs of hands, everything is double. He's doubling Duchamp. And Duchamp here is a man dressed as a woman, and Morimura is a man dressed as a woman, as a man who is dressed as a woman. So we have like 3 times doubles of somebody pretending to be something else and exposing actually the question mark about what is female or male identity and how do we understand. So I would say Morimura's practice in this sense is about question marks rather than declaration. If the previous artists I referred to were declaring something about something being very honest, very direct, Morimura is actually blurring away everything. We're not sure anymore. We're not sure if he's Japanese. We're not sure if he's French. We're not sure if he's a man, if he's a woman, if he's white, if he's Asian. You know, all these things are blurred in these images. And Morimura is playing with our notions, with our imaginary dichotomies of something which is clearly this or that, and saying something, it is this and that, not this or that, but this and that at the same time. And later series, he actually created a very large series called Art History, in which he took different famous images. Frida Kahlo in this case, we have the all impressionist represented, and many other images. Las Meninas in the Prado in Madrid is also one of his main subjects. And so what I'm trying to say about Morimura is that through the performance of a man who is pretending to be a woman, and through the blurring of the lines and through bringing these aspects together, he achieved something very important. He achieved question marks. He achieved this stability that we are not sure anymore and that we are ready to examine our notions and values. And through this practice, he opened the door in a very different way to what happened with the Ado. While Araki, let's take Araki as a signifier, as a model. Well, Araki opened the door for people like Hiromix and Nagashima and allowed them in a very certain sexualized way in as women who photograph themselves, but in the end, these photographs are semi-pornographic and are used in certain ways. Morimura created an atmosphere that, on one hand, one could say he gave up his privilege as a photographer, because the classic view is The artist, the painter, the photographer is behind the camera, is protected. We don't see him. And he's taking the photograph of the naked woman who is presented in front of the camera. She's out of her powers. She's given, the photographer or the painter will decide how she's going to look. We go to the museum, we see tons of naked women. We hardly see any naked men. And this has a relationship, a power relationship of the man creating and the woman being represented. While Morimura inverted that. He actually gave up the power of being behind the camera and went naked in front of the camera and created a moment that was questioning this power relationship between the man behind the camera and the woman in front of the camera. So once young women adopted the view of Morimura, i.e. becoming so representative or performative through different aspects, they could go on with this idea. So the first young woman I would like to introduce is Sawada Tomoko. She was born 1977, so more or less the same age like Hiromix and Nagashima. And the first project she created is called ID 400. You know these passport picture machines, right? You put, I don't know, €1 and you get 4 pictures that you can put in your passport. And this was her graduation project. She was also from Osaka. She went to a parking lot where they had a toilet just next to the photo machine. And she went in 100 times, and each time she dressed a bit differently. One time she put her hair like this, and one time she put her hair like this and changed the clothing and did. But it's all Sawada Tomoko. It's all the same person, just being 100 times together. Now, when you come to the museum, and I had the pleasure of displaying this in a big exhibition several years ago, and we actually received, the small passport photos. We had to put them together on the wall. You ask yourself, how does Sawada Tomoko look like? You're not sure anymore because, the passport photo is supposed to be our real self. We put it in our certificate, in our documents. We go to immigration, they check our passport and they look that we look the same like in the photo. But she's playing with this idea. She's tantalizing. Do we have one look? Are we one thing? She created 100 like that in this work. She's questioning who is the real Sawada Tomoko. It's not quite sure anymore. And she carried on. I just tell you, she created 1,800 images so far. I don't think we know exactly who is Sawada Tomoko. And what is interesting, I call Sawada a photographer without a camera. Because what she does is that she's using photography procedures that we all know, the passport photo machine, the school graduation photography that we all have. So she goes to this studio and she takes this procedure of the school photography, and each and every face in this picture is hers. So she photographed herself 400 times because it's a big series, each time with different uniform, and even the teachers. And, this is like classical image in Japan that you have these girls. And then she created this picture in Photoshop, just putting all the images together. She carried on. One thing in Japan, which is still common, is arranged marriage. And before the arranged marriage, young women will prepare a book with images, different styles, dressing with kimono, dressing with a dress. It's called omiai. And the book is sent to the potential husband's family to look at and decide. So she went to the studio where you do omiai pictures. She paid the photographer to photograph her. But the big difference is that she enlarged them to 2 meters high and put them in the museum. So while in Japan, this is something very private and you do it for the eyes of the other family, once she exposed it and put it into the museum and the public sphere, she actually became very critical of this practice and showed something which is supposed to be private and sort of secretive. She opened it up to foreign eyes to look at and actually question this practice. She carried on. A few years later, she created this series again of photo passport images with, again, you can see the variety of different styles she presented herself. And then she went into another issue of the maids. It's a kind of a fashion in Japan to dress like this, and for young women who play with image of the maids, the Victorian style, or maybe in France you also have something similar to that. So she played with different styles of dress and ideas and pretended to be Tomoko in 1,000 versions, 1,000 ideas, never looking the same in each and every picture that she took of herself and presented here. So if I just want, I said 1,800 pictures of Tomoko Sawada, and none of them is similar to the other. And the question is, who is Tomoko Sawada? And I think first of all, by not using the camera herself, but putting herself in the position of photographic procedures, that she's using the photo, the passport photo, the marriage photo, the school photo, the omi-ai photo, all these procedures that women are being photographed in Japan to serve a certain social system that she functions within. She becomes a very critical social critic of what is going on, how women are aligned into certain roles in the society, being expected to be good wife and educating mother. It's like something that is part of the idea of how women should behave, which she is questioning. Again, I want to put the word question or questioning, or the acts of questioning, at the center of the performative style of photography that actually repeats, reenacts, puts forward different styles of behavior expected within Japanese society that are being challenged. Here's another one, Yanagi Miwa, very famous photographer in Japan, and very interesting one. So her first project was called Elevator Girls. Now, in Japan, if you ever went to a department store, when you enter the elevator, there's a young woman dressed in full uniform, and she's standing with her face to the buttons, and she will say, first floor, kitchen utilities, second floor, underwear, third floor, women's garments, etc., etc. She's just talking this kind of text of what is going on each floor, and no personality obviously of these women, because they are just in the service. Something I could imagine could be with the speaker, but still you have this, and of course they will come out at the floor and will bow to you to give a sense of very good service. Now Miwa, Yanagi took it out. She took the Elevator Girls and created a performance. So the first notion of this series is a performance. Performance of young women dressed in Elevator Girls uniform, doing different acts. But what is different is that she took them out of the elevator and put them into this kind of strange artificial environment, as we see in this picture, or we see in this picture, you see it's a big hole with this kind of vegetation in the windows, and they're lying on the floor. We have them sitting in big holes, very decorative, and, with special light, etc. But the women are identityless. They're just in these uniforms. They're completely actors within the performance. So first it was a performance, and as we know, a lot of performance artists are looking for opportunities to document the event. So they just take photographs of the performance. But in this case, the photographs became so attractive and so interesting and so dominant that some people think it was created as photography in the first place and not as a documentation of a performance. So here is an interesting case where performance and photography merge together to become something new as a performative photograph. Now, if we think about the symbolism that Yanagi is creating here by using the elevator girls as the protagonist of her photography, she's telling us again something quite harsh about the reality of Japanese women in Japanese society. They're denied of being autonomous, being individual, being independent. They have to kind of perform according to a certain protocol, to a certain service or expected roles, which are very limited. Yes, you can imagine that being an elevator girl is not great fun. After 2 days, you become really tired, but you have to perform it for a certain period. And it creates something quite limiting and quite depressing for the women who are part of it. So for Yanagi, using the elevator girls is a kind of an avatar or a symbol or a protagonist, as I said before, of women's situation, women's fate, women's life in Japan that are not very individualistic. They cannot perform whatever they want. They have to obey a certain protocol and live according to certain lifestyle and expectations. In a different series, she did something quite interesting, I think. She took very young women of 20 years of age, 20 to 25, and she asked them to imagine how they will be in 50 years, when they will be in their 70s. And each one of them created a story telling what she expects herself to be when she's 70. And then together they created a performance. The young woman performed herself as a grandmother. And they took together the liberty to create different scenes and different styles. We have here a grandmother who is meeting all her tribe, one would say, so many grandchildren coming to visit her. Another one who is imagining herself to be pampered and treated, beauty parlor or something like that, being massaged and taken care of in the best way. Or someone who's taking it crazily, going around the world in a motorbike and celebrating being freed of parenthood and taking care. So I think what Yanagi wanted to do here is to express there is freedom in imagination. Probably these young women, when they're 25 or 27, they will get married and they will get into the system of taking care of their family and growing their children, etc., what is expected from young women in Japan. But probably there's a way out when you're 70, when you're beyond your duties. You can imagine to do anything. And so grandmotherhood is not a punishment. It's not old age, oh my God. It's freedom. It's to gain something that you can't gain in your young age, but you can gain in your older age. And she's playing with that in a very smart way, actually projecting from this point of the freedom of the older age on the limitation of the younger age. And she's kind of, again, creating critique of what is expected in the next 50 years before you get to this point of self-freedom. And another way, which is interesting here, is the way that Yanagi created fairy tales. She took all these Christian Andersens and Graham Greene and all Grimm brothers, fairy tales about the princess who's waiting for the Prince Charming to come and save her, etc. And she just created these stories, a little bit like horror stories, because the princess who's waiting for the prince to save her probably is not going to be saved. So she's making these, ideas which are very ubiquitous and very common in Japan. The idea of the prince and the princess are very common. And she just makes them into horror stories. So she's criticizing by actually opposite of the common knowledge of the fairy tale and bringing it to something that becomes kind of a horror story in her images. A younger, much younger performative artist is Tokyo Rumando. And you see, she's born 1980. And she's also playing with the idea of the woman in certain roles. For example, the high school girls, which is also a sexualized image in Japan. But she's also taking Mishima Yukio, who is a famous novelist in Japan, quite a problematic one, very right-wing, extreme ideas about Japanese militarism and the emperor system, etc. But she's playing with this, kind of associating the power of Mishima to herself, or pretending to become someone who's self-fashioning in this game. Here's another example, Katayama Mari, who's an interesting story. Katayama was born with some problems in her limbs. And when she was 8 years old, they had to cut her foot and half leg. So this is her body. And you can see she's very beautiful, but she suffers from this problem of her limbs. And she created through her life a lot of embroidery and accessories that she decorated her body and her room. And again, something that was, she made a performance actually to show the different objects that she created. And she inserted herself into this background, into this environment, because she wanted to create a self-image which is playing with this kind of space. I think her position is in between the position of what I called the selfie of Hiromix and Nagashima and the performative of Sawada and Yanagi. So she's kind of an in-between because of her special situation, the way she is working. Do I need to 5 minutes? Yeah, sure. Well, I think we had 90 minutes, didn't we? It's 90 minutes, not 60 minutes. That's what's written outside. $90 or $60? $90. I don't know. If you want me, I can cut, but carry on. Okay, so here's another example. Actually, I'm very friendly with Ryoko, so I think her work is very brilliant. And again, think always that women's position in Japan is problematic, is troubled. And a lot of these women are trying to discuss or bring forward, without sound, without very direct critique, but actually expose their experience in different ways. And, you know, you can talk about silencing, you can talk about pain, you can talk about denial of individuality, denial of self-expression. All these questions are there. And Ryoko Suzuki is actually doing that through very painful treatment of her body. She exposes this pain and this position through the treatment of the body. She brings the material aspect of pain and how we find this to be. So these are the images of Suzuki-san. And I would like to go back a little bit to a little bit older artist. Boubou de la Madeleine is a pen name of Yagita, forgot her first name, and Shimada Yoshiko. They're working together for a long time. Mizuha-san is 19 minutes? 大丈夫ですか? はい。 So Boubou and Yoshiko were working for a long time together. Then they split. They went on different careers. But what I really like about them is that they took history, political history of Japan into their hands and created different projects that looked into the possibility of reenactment or bringing some images into the questions. Bubu, first of all, was part of Dump Type. Dump Type was a performance group in Kyoto in the 1990s, led by Furuhashi Teiji. And actually, I was in France 3 years ago, and there was a huge exhibition in Metz of performance art, and Dump Type was at the center of that exhibition. So I'm just thinking that the last time I saw a big exhibition was actually in France, in Metz. And so Bubu was part of Dump Types. She's a performance artist par excellence, as you say. And she created wonderful events. And look at this one. This performance was done in a very dirty industrial beach with all this unpleasant background. And she and this transvestite performer came out of the sea. She was dressed with garbage bags, plastic bags, and he's dressed in this tutu, and they created this really interesting gender issues on this beach in Japan. Then she created also this series of self-portraits through performance. But with Yoshiko Shimada, they created several projects that are actually questioning the relationship between Japan and America, which is also a very troubled issue. As you know, America defeated Japan, and then American military stayed in Japan in the bases. And this became a very loaded subject of the relationship between the American soldiers, Japanese civil population, Japanese women, American soldiers, where are the Japanese men? You know, this is a very loaded subject. I won't go into all these details. It's a lecture on its own right. But what Shimada and Bubu did is this performance called Made in Occupied Japan. Made in Occupied Japan is actually a borrowed title. It used to be the stamp on products of Japan between 1945 and 1952. For example, teacups, porcelain teacups that were exported had this stamp, Made in Occupied Japan, because you know, Japan was under American occupation forces. But also, one of the demands of the American occupation forces, or one of the compliments of Japanese government, was to create prostitution that served the American military forces. It's a horror story. But they created in this performance a relationship between a Japanese prostitute and an American soldier, in some ways trying to talk about this relationship, this power relationship with an occupying military and a civil population that being performed through the woman and the American soldier, while these are actually two women that you see here. One is Bubu acting as the woman. One is Yoshiko Shimada, who's acting like the American soldier. But it's a very loaded and very interesting performance that they created as a video. And this very famous picture, I'm sure that you know it in its original form, is when Hirohito, the emperor, Showa emperor, came to the American embassy to meet General Douglas MacArthur, who was the governor of Japan during the occupation time. And they took this picture that MacArthur was very nonchalant, you know, standing above, kind of tall and really careless. And the emperor was very nervous and very small and very tensed. And many Japanese said that only after they saw this picture, they really realized that Japan was defeated in the war. Because before it was kind of a rumor. But just when they saw it, how tall, nonchalant, powerful MacArthur was in comparison to the tension on the emperor, then they realized that something really dramatic happened. And a lot of artists went back to this image. Even Morimura has an image of this, because it represented for them something very crucial. It was taken on September 27th. That's 1 month into the occupation, 1 month and 12 days. But it was a very dramatic political image for the Japanese. And here, when they repeat it, again, it's Bubu and Yoshiko, and it's kind of, right, it's a parody. It's not a serious picture, it's a parody. But the parody is meant to bring the political and the symbolic into something which is also talking about gender and private and daily life and all these aspects. And the last image I will show you is only Yoshiko's, Shimada Yoshiko's project, which she is creating. Wow, we have to know some context here. Anyone recognizing this kind of image? Because somebody talked about it today in another presentation. There is an image of young woman dressed in Korean dress, sitting next to an empty chair that invites people to sit next to her. This is the image, the symbolic image of the comfort women. Comfort women, ianfu in Japanese, are women across Asia, especially from Korea and China, but also in Indonesia and the Philippines and, I don't know, many places that the Japanese military took to become, I can't even say prostitutes, but to serve sexual service to Japanese military. It's a horror story again, but it was silenced for many years and came up to public notion in 1995, which was the year of 50 years for the end of the war. And actually the granddaughters of these women in Korea and China started to talk about it because their grandmothers silenced about it and the daughters silenced about it. It was just the granddaughters who brought it. And actually 91 was the first woman in Korea who came out and spoke about it. And since then, since 1995, it's up on the agenda. It's up on the conflict between Japan, Korea, and China, how to sort out this problem. And should Japan apologize for that? Or if Japan apologized to that, was that enough? Is this a real apology or just, you know, comfortable apology? This is a big issue between Japan and Korea and Japan and China. It's not sorted. It's still a very sensitive issue, especially now in Japan, where you have a more right-wing government that tries to what we call revise the history. I don't want to go into that, but look it up. You will find a lot of information. Now, the thing is that this sculpture of the young woman is placed originally in front of the Japanese embassy in Seoul, the Korean capital. And every Wednesday, anyone associated with comfort women, there are very few left, about 10 people still alive. They're in their 90s. So either the daughters or granddaughters, the people who are active in this ongoing controversy, are coming to the embassy and taking pictures there. And what Shimada-san did is first she brought up the notion that there were comfort women in Japan as well. About 10% of the total number of comfort women were Japanese who were sent out. If you want to look into that, there's a film called Sandakan No. 8. And it deals with Japanese comfort women. It's a very important and interesting film. And when she dressed up like this, like a comfort woman with an empty chair, and as you see, she did it in the Japanese embassy in London, she actually brought back this image. And this is very unusual for a Japanese woman to collaborate with Korean issues and bring back this very politically high sensitive subject. Another person who is interesting in this respect is Ishikawa Mao. Mao is living in Okinawa. She was born in Okinawa. As you see, she was born in 1952. 1952, most of Japan ended the occupation, but not Okinawa. Okinawa stayed under American occupation until 1972. So when Mao was a young woman, she was actually living under American occupation. She has a huge series of images, which is fantastic, but I won't go into that, taken in 1977 of the relationship of young Japanese women and American black soldiers, GIs, working in Okinawa. But what I want to show you is a recent project, which is called The Grand History of Okinawa, of Ryukyu, actually. She doesn't use the word Okinawa. Okinawa is the Japanese, is the name of the main island, but Japanese government is using Okinawa as the name of this prefecture, while for people born there, Ryukyu is the independent name of the kingdom that they used to have. So she's calling it the Grand Scroll of Okinawa, photographic scroll of Okinawa. And in different chapters in the scroll, she's describing different chapters of Okinawa's history through the use of performance. So you can see here an American pilot and a young Okinawan girls. But she also has these historical images of the people of Ryukyu fishing and living their peaceful life before they had to be the victims of these huge political forces. First, Japan taking over Okinawa in 1879, then the American occupation, and still the presence of the American bases in Okinawa. So it's a big and tragic history, including a conflict between Japanese soldiers and the civil population of Okinawa. Again, I can't go into all these details. You will have to find out more. But in the scroll, she's actually reenacting, recomposing, performing these conflicts between Japanese soldiers and Okinawan citizens that she brings forward as a performance, including this kind of conflict between American soldiers, Japanese soldiers, and the Okinawan civilians who died as part of this conflict. Okay, and I want to go into a third aspect of women's photography. I will take the last 15 minutes to do that. And this is what I call exploring photography. So the two first parts, the selfie and the performatives, was how women photograph women, how women photograph their own life, photograph their own aspects. So it's more of a narrative photography. It's a photography that tells a story. Either way, whether it's about the self or about the environment or about the history as I brought it. But exploring photography is something else. It's something about how Japanese photographers, women photographers, explore the medium itself. What do they have to say about photography as a language, as a medium that through which you are looking at the meaning of this image? And the first one I want to talk about is Onodera Yuki. If some of you were in our conversation about an hour ago, Yuki-san is actually working with different aspects of photography. Most important, in my view, is the silhouette and the way she's presenting the question of light, how light is functioning in photography when it is blocked, when it is becoming something that we cannot see the returning light, but it's actually blocked. Or in other series that she's photographing a certain level of, one could say, performance through objects that she's putting up. And again, putting the different possibilities of silhouette through actual objects being placed onto the paper, the printing paper that she's using, or by playing with the camera, inserting a marble or a pearl-like into the camera to create some disturbance into the apparatus that can help us understand how the apparatus is actually functioning. A few more ideas coming from the idea of exploring photography come in Otsuka Chino. She's actually, like Yuki is living in Paris and Otsuka is living in London since very young age. She actually moved to England for her schooling. She was at Summerhill. She wasn't a very good student in Japan, so her parents decided to take her to England, and she created a very interesting series. So if I show you these images like this and this and this, you think, yeah, this is a family album, right? It's nothing special. But what is special is that this is Yuki when she was Chino when she was 7, and this is Chino when she's now 30 or so, and she photoshopped them two together. These are two images of the same person, old age and young age. It's not her mother, it's herself. And all these images are composed of her young age and her current age. She created something very tantalizing about the idea of, again, what is photography? Is photography a documentation of the moment? You know, like Roland Barthes is talking about it in La Chambre Claire, when, you know, this very specific moment of catching his mother, and this is like the last moment. No, she's playing with it. It's like ongoing project. It was photographed in, I don't know, 1984 and in 2007, and it's the same image that we are meeting of the same person in two periods in life, which is very interesting. Of course, you know, modern photography and digitality helps a lot in this, but what is coming out of these images is a very interesting question mark about lifetime and how we change through life, and what is the meaning of these different aspects that we think of ourselves and the image. In a similar vein, similar mode, is Takagi Kozue, who created this series of portraits. Anyone has a clue what's going on here? So she took a portrait and she split it into half, and then she doubled each half separately. And she exposed, we normally think about ourselves as similar, as symmetrical. But she actually exposes that we are not symmetric, and that if you double each half separately, you get two different persons. And I think this is exquisite. It's really using the quality of digital photography to expose something we're not aware of. Normally, we don't see this difference between the two sides so clearly, and she just puts it in front of us and says, look, you are actually two different things if you double it. Look here. And this one as well. So they look like identical twins, right? But actually, it kind of exposes the doubleness that we have. I find it to be very exciting kind of photography that plays with this notion of what is hidden, how photography exposes us. We had Sawada exposing, you know, the different shapes we can be. But Takagi is actually opening something quite different in kind of the biology of our body and how it does exist. Hayashi Natsumi is playing with the idea of the decisive moment, you know, this catching, the snapshot. But she's doing that by just jumping in front of the camera and catching herself in the air and bringing something, again, something quite fairy tale-ish or ghosty-like, or again, we never see the kind of, you know, this floating in the air, but she's doing it in a very, very interesting way. So again, it's an exploration into the nature of photography by bringing the decisive moment. I don't know the French term, but it's Henri Cartier-Bresson with this original term. And she exposes that in a very interesting and feminine way that she's bringing. Kawauchi Rinko. Again, what I like about Kawauchi is that she's very, very private and intimate and motherly photographer. She's at home. She has now probably more grown up, but she had 2 babies and she was working hard as a mother. So she took the homely atmosphere as her field. And you can see that her pictures are very intimate in this sense. She's kind of a photographer of tiny details. She's looking close. She's not looking at grand history or something, but everything is about, being here and now. A lot of pictures. She's normally, when she has an exhibition, it's a projector with hundreds of images that she puts, really gives the environment of a home, of a private life. But she also explores light. You see, if I spoke about Yuki's silhouette, so Kawauchi is working with the opposites, like overexposure, too much light that burns everything. You get this light, bright, white color in your face, which is the result of a flash, which is overexposure. It's the opposite. In silhouette, we're talking about backlight. Here's the front light that makes this flatness become. So it's a very interesting exploration again. Or the opposite is when, this tiny light from a cigarette is in the dark. You can see like a firefly. Yeah, the firefly of the cigarette is kind of interesting. Or fires on the mountain, which are, this is very dramatic. But she's working with light, not just as light as an abstract. Light has a shape or has material in her work, which I find kind of interesting. And, this kind of hanabi, the fireworks in the summer. Always, she has a whole book about hanabi, which is part of her. But also the sun eclipse, which is a very traditional subject in Japanese photography. I have a whole lecture about just sun eclipses in photography. Or the full moon also becoming very simple images, but very interesting. And I think we are about to finish with Noguchi Rika, who's also a very conceptual photographer and working again with light. She's photographing the sun. She has a whole series of just photographing the sun. So, an easy interpretation would be, yes, the sun and Japan is always associated. It's the symbol and the Hinomaru, the flag. Okay, let's go beyond that and look at the sun as the light source or the life source, is something which, and also this is anti-photography because, as I said before, photography is about collecting the light returning from objects. If you direct your camera to the sun, you're actually doing something wrong. You burn. It's too much light. You can't take photograph of the sun. So in doing so, she's very risky because she's taking the light source itself and not the light returning from objects. This is anti-photography. Clear cut. This is not photography. This is something that works against the logic of photography. And yet she's successful in creating these very burny, very light-washed images that are part of her practice, or something that goes as night sun or something along these lines. So with this notion, I thank you very much. Thank you.
Je vous remercie infiniment pour cette présentation très, 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 très impressionnante. Et nous avons aujourd'hui Madame Yuki Onodera dans la salle. Donc, voilà, c'était très, très impressionnant pour moi. Si, on peut terminer ou...
If you have questions,
voilà, s'il y a des questions...
I hope by the end of this year, I'm still in the process of it, yeah. She was asking about my book.
Will the book be available in France?
It will be in English. It will be.
It doesn't matter.
On Amazon, I guess. So yeah, I mean the world is small these days, right?
Yeah.
Merci beaucoup. Bon, si vous n'avez pas d'autres questions, peut-être... Oui, on va se terminer. Bah, donc, je vous remercie infiniment. Arigatou gozaimashita. Merci.